The 1880s, America was a land torn between two identities, caught in the fragile space between the old wounds of slavery and the false promises of freedom. Only a generation earlier, the Civil War had ended. Chains had been broken, and yet for millions of black men, women, and children, true freedom still felt just out of reach, like a dream glimpsed but never touched. The Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery had promised a new dawn, but the reality of life in the 1880s told a far different story. Walk down a dirt road in the South during those years, and you would hear the hollow scrape of plows on thin, stubborn soil. Most black families, once enslaved, now found themselves locked in the cruel system of sharecropping. They worked the land from sunrise to sunset, bending their backs in the same cotton fields that had once enslaved them. The difference now was legal, not practical. Sharecropping bound them with contracts, debt, and dependency. The plantation owner no longer called himself master, but the power he held over black families felt hauntingly familiar. At the end of each harvest, many families discovered they owed more than they had earned. And so, year after year, they worked without ever truly climbing free of poverty's grip. Yet even in this world of hardship, dignity was never lost. Families gathered in wooden cabins with dirt floors, sharing cornbread baked in iron skillets and songs passed down through generations. On Sunday mornings, the church became more than a place of worship. It was a refuge, a sanctuary of hope. The voices of men and women rose together, singing hymns that carried the strength of survival. For many black Americans, the church in the 1880s was the heart of the community, a space to educate, to organize, and to keep the flame of freedom alive. Still, outside the walls of the church, the cruel weight of racism pressed down hard. The Reconstruction era had ended abruptly in 1877, and with its collapse came a tide of new laws and old hatred. White supremacist groups spread terror in the night, burning homes, torching black-owned businesses, and lynching those who dared to claim their rightful place in society. For a black man to walk into town and look a white man in the eye could mean danger. For a black woman to stand her ground in defense of her dignity was often met with violence. Fear hung heavy in the air, but so too did courage. Imagine a mother in Mississippi in the 1880s. She tucks her children into bed, whispering prayers over them, knowing she cannot shield them from the world outside her door. She rises before dawn to work the fields, her hands cracked from labor, her heart heavy with worry. And yet she teaches her children to read by candlelight, spelling out words from an old Bible, determined that they will grow up with knowledge she was once denied. Her resilience is an act of defiance. Her faith in their future is a weapon against despair. In the North, life offered more opportunity, but it was not free of prejudice. Black men and women who migrated to cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, or New York found themselves laboring in factories, working as porters or cleaning houses. Their wages were meager, their neighborhoods overcrowded, and discrimination followed them into schools, workplaces, and public spaces. Yet here too, a different kind of resilience took root. Black newspapers began to circulate, giving voice to their struggles and their hopes. Leaders rose, preachers, teachers, and activists, calling on their people to hold fast to dignity, to claim education as a pathway to power, and to fight for a better tomorrow. The 1880s was also the decade when the seeds of organized resistance began to grow. The memory of slavery was fresh, and the promise of equality written into the Constitution seemed like a cruel joke to those who faced daily humiliation. But voices of leadership rose, like Ida B. Wells, a young journalist who began her fearless fight against lynching, writing truths that others dared not speak. Or Frederick Douglass, older now, but still a thunderous voice reminding America of its unfinished work. They spoke not only for survival, but for dignity, justice, and the right to live as fully human. For children growing up in this time, life was both harsh and strangely beautiful. Barefoot boys chased each other through fields, their laughter echoing across the land that had both chained and freed their families. Young girls braided each other's hair, dreaming of futures where they might become teachers or nurses instead of field hands. These dreams mattered because they were planted in soil that had long been poisoned with oppression. Each dream was an act of rebellion against the world as it was. In small communities across the South and North alike, education became the heartbeat of progress. Freedmen's schools, though often underfunded and attacked by mobs, lit the spark of hope. To hold a book in one's hands, to trace letters on a slate board, was a quiet revolution. Every word learned was another step away from the silence forced upon enslaved ancestors. Teachers, many of them women, risked everything to teach in these schools, knowing that knowledge was the one thing that could never be repossessed. But while the black community reached upward, America as a whole was changing too. The 1880s was a time of invention, of railroads stitching the country together, of telephones and electric lights beginning to spread. For many white Americans, it was an era of great progress and expansion. For black Americans, it was a reminder of the two Americas coexisting side by side, one advancing with opportunity, the other still shackled by racism and poverty. And yet, through it all, black life in the 1880s was never defined solely by suffering. It was also defined by joy, culture, and endurance. Families gathered for music, for food, for community. Spirituals and folk songs carried hidden meanings layered with sorrow and hope. Quilts stitched together by grandmothers told stories through patterns, preserving history and fabric. Oral traditions flourished, tales of ancestors, fables of animals and tricksters who outwitted stronger foes, reminding children that cleverness and courage could triumph even in dark times. This was the paradox of life in the 1880s, to live every day with the shadow of injustice pressing close, but to carve out spaces of joy that no law, no hate could take away. To be black in this era was to endure unimaginable trials, but it was also to embody a resilience that future generations would look back on with awe. By the end of the decade, whispers of change stirred once more. Black communities, though battered, were not broken. They were building institutions, churches, schools, and newspapers that would lay the groundwork for the movements to come. They were holding on to hope like a lantern in the dark, refusing to let it go out. And though the road ahead was long and filled with storms, they believed deeply that their struggle carried meaning, that one day America might live up to its own promises. The 1880s was not simply a chapter of pain, but a testament to the unbreakable will of a people determined to claim their place in history. Their story was not just about survival, it was about humanity, about dignity, and about the enduring dream of freedom that no system could fully extinguish. The sun rises over the 1880s landscape, casting light on a country still learning how to live with itself. For many, the Civil War was already history distant, fading, wrapped in nostalgia or resentment depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line you lived. But for black Americans, the war's consequences were alive in every moment of their daily existence. Freedom had been declared, yes, but the fight to be seen, to be treated as fully human, was just beginning. Life in the 1880s was a daily negotiation between hope and survival. In small southern towns, black men walked carefully, measuring every step, aware that an angry glance or a misunderstood word could mean the end of their lives. Lynchings were not whispered rumors. They were public spectacles. Cruel warnings meant to remind the community of its place. Mothers shielded their children's eyes when such violence erupted, but the memory always remained. Trauma lingered in silence, but courage lingered too. In these years, dignity often lived in small acts. A father polishing his shoes before walking to church, though he owned little else. A mother braiding her daughter's hair in the morning, whispering lessons of pride and beauty into each twist. A teacher refusing to give up on students, even when chalk and books were scarce. These were not simply gestures of survival, they were statements of defiance. Quiet but unyielding reminders that black life was valuable, sacred, and worth fighting for. Consider the story of a young boy in Georgia. His parents, once enslaved, now worked under the burden of sharecropping, trapped in a cycle of debt they could never escape. Yet in the evenings, his mother placed a tattered book in his hands. The boy learned to read by lantern light, each page a doorway to worlds beyond the fields. For him, learning to read was not simply an education. It was a rebellion against a system that had once outlawed his ancestors from even touching a book. That boy grew into a man who carried dignity like armor, proving that knowledge could be as powerful as any weapon. In northern cities, though opportunities were wider, prejudice still stalked every street. Black men found work as railroad porters, lifting heavy trunks for travelers who often refused to look them in the eye. Women worked as laundresses or domestic servants, paid a fraction of what white women earned. Housing was poor, neighborhoods overcrowded. Yet within these tight-knit communities, culture blossomed. Music drifted out of churches and dance halls. Stories were shared on stoops and in parlors. Every gathering was more than leisure, it was survival, a way of saying, "We are here. We will not disappear." And while the daily struggles were endless, the 1880s also gave rise to voices of fierce resistance. Ida B. Wells, just in her 20s, stood against lynching with courage that shook the nation. When friends of hers were murdered in Memphis for daring to own a successful business, she took up her pen, documenting the violence others refused to see. Her words cut through silence, forcing America to confront its own cruelty. She knew the risks her life was constantly threatened, but her determination never wavered. In her voice, thousands found their own strength. At the same time, black institutions were being built with quiet determination. Churches raised funds to construct schools. Teachers worked in one-room classrooms, sometimes teaching with only slates and scraps of paper. Students shared books, writing lessons in the margins, eager to learn whatever they could. Colleges for black students like Fisk and Howard stood as monuments to possibility. Out of these classrooms would emerge leaders, thinkers, ministers, and activists who would shape the future. The 1880s was not only about endurance, it was about preparation, about laying a foundation for the battles yet to come. And within homes, within families, the essence of black life was not despair, but resilience. The kitchen smelled of beans and collard greens, meals made from little but shared with love. Grandmothers told stories of Africa, of ancestors, of survival through centuries of chains. Children played games in the yard, laughing freely even when their parents' faces were lined with worry. Love persisted. Joy existed. Humanity thrived, even in the cracks of a broken system. For white America, the 1880s were years of expansion, industry, and invention. Railroads connected distant states. Cities boomed. Immigrants poured in, chasing opportunity. For many, it was the age of progress, but progress was not shared equally. For Black America, this was a period of waiting at the edge of opportunity, watching the nation move forward while they were told to stay behind. Yet even from the margins, they found ways to push forward. Each Black-owned business, no matter how small, was an act of progress. Each book read, each sermon preached, each child taught was a declaration that they too belonged in the story of America. Imagine again a Cena Sunday gathering in a small wooden church in Alabama. The pews are crowded, voices rising in a hymn. The preacher speaks of freedom, of justice, of God's promises. Outside, the world may be hostile, but inside there is unity. People clap, they sing, they lift their heads high. In that space, they are not simply survivors, they are visionaries, holding fast to a dream their ancestors never lived to see. That dream becomes their inheritance, carried forward with determination that no law could erase. As the 1880s closed, the shadows of Jim Crow deepened. Segregation hardened into law, denying Black Americans the right to vote, the right to equal education, the right to live free of daily humiliation. And yet, in the face of this tightening grip, the spirit of resistance grew stronger. The seeds planted in this decade would one day bloom into a movement that changed the world. The men and women of the 1880s did not live to see the civil rights movement of the 1960s, but their sacrifices, their endurance, their small victories of dignity were the soil from which that movement grew. The truth of the 1880s is this: Black life was hard, often unbearably so, but it was never without hope. It was filled with mothers who dreamed bigger, dreams for their children than the world allowed. Fathers who worked themselves into exhaustion but still found time to tell stories at night. Children who carried within them the unshakable belief that tomorrow could be brighter. Every hymn sung, every word learned, every act of resistance, no matter how small, was a brick laid in the foundation of freedom. When we look back on the 1880s, we see both pain and power. We see injustice that should never have been. But we also see the quiet, steady strength of a people who refused to give up on themselves or on America. Even when America gave up on them, their story is not one of defeat. It is one of endurance, of resilience, of an unbreakable will to survive with dignity intact. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that even in the harshest of times, when the weight of oppression sought to crush their spirits, Black Americans of the 1880s carved out a life rich with culture, faith, love, and courage. They lived as proof that freedom was more than a legal right, it was a human truth. One they carried in their bones, one they passed down like a sacred inheritance. Their lives remind us that history is not only written in battles and laws, but in the quiet strength of ordinary people who refuse to surrender their humanity. And so, when we ask what life was really like in the 1880s, the answer is both painful and profound. It was a life defined by struggle, yes, but also by dignity, by resistance, and by an enduring dream of justice that would one day transform America itself.